December 22nd, 1944, 300 meters east of Bastogne. The snow had turned pink beneath Klaus Weber's body. He could see it, the color spreading like watercolor on wet paper, but couldn't feel the cold anymore. That frightened him more than the shrapnel in his abdomen, more than the sounds of battle receding into the distance, more than the realization that his own men had left him behind. They'd checked his pulse at the wrist, found nothing, moved on. He'd wanted to call out, but his voice had frozen somewhere between his lungs and his throat. So he lay there, 23 years old, a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, watching the December sky darken through the skeletal branches of Belgian oaks. His right hand twitched, not by choice, some involuntary nerve response to blood loss and shock, but it moved. And that movement, that tiny gesture of a body refusing to surrender, would change everything. The propaganda had been specific, exacting, relentless. Since 1933, Klaus Weber had been shaped by it. First in the Hitler youth camps outside Stuttgart, where boys ran obstacle courses while instructors shouted about racial destiny and the weakness of democratic nations. The Americans, they'd learned, were a mongrel people, soft, divided by their own diversity, weakened by their obsession with individual comfort, incapable of the discipline that forged true warriors. They have no stomach for sacrifice, his training officer had declared in the summer of 1943, pacing before 200 recruits in the morning heat. They produce movies and automobiles and jazz music. We produce soldiers. The other recruits had nodded. Weber had nodded. What else could you do when every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every conversation with adults who'd lived through the Great War confirmed the same narrative? The Americans had entered that war late, fought for less than 2 years, claimed victory, then retreated behind their ocean walls. They were merchants, not warriors, capable of industry perhaps, but not of the iron will required to dominate a battlefield. Weber had believed it the way you believe in gravity, not as opinion, but as observable fact. He'd believed it through officer training. He'd believed it through the invasion of Poland. Though he'd been too young to participate, he'd believed it through the campaigns in France and the Eastern Front transfers that had become increasingly common as the war ground into its 5th year. He'd believed it on the morning of December 16th, 1944, when his division received orders to push west through the Ardennes forest. The offensive would catch the Americans by surprise, commanders promised. Their lines were thin, their troops inexperienced. One decisive blow and the Allied advance would shatter. The propaganda machine had assured them. Americans panicked under pressure. They'd fold. For the first few days, it had seemed true. The Wehrmacht advanced. Small American units scattered. The weather-grounded Allied aircraft. Victory felt tangible, inevitable, until the forest paths narrowed, until the supply lines stretched too thin, until they reached the crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had dug in and refused to move. That's where everything started to unravel. The battle had been chaos. Not the organized chaos of training exercises, but the real thing. The kind where orders dissolved into screaming, where the smoke was so thick you couldn't tell enemy from ally until you were close enough to die. Weber's platoon had been advancing through a grove of shattered pine trees when the artillery found them. Not German artillery, American. The shells came in waves, each one a thunderclap that turned earth into shrapnel and men into parts of men. Weber had thrown himself behind a fallen log, pressing his face into frozen mud that smelled of cordite and copper. The barrage lasted 7 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Weber counted 9 men still moving out of 32. "Fall back," someone shouted. Maybe their sergeant. Maybe someone who just assumed command because the sergeant was no longer capable of speech. Weber ran. They all ran. The American lines had seemed impossibly close, close enough to see individual faces behind the rifles, close enough to hear English being shouted in accents Weber couldn't distinguish. Midwest farmers, Brooklyn laborers, Texas ranchers. To him, they were just the enemy, and the enemy was supposed to break. They didn't break. The Americans held their position, and the Wehrmacht line collapsed backward through the trees. That's when the shell hit. Not a direct hit, but close enough. Weber felt the concussion before he felt the pain, felt himself lifted and thrown like a child's toy. When he landed, something was wrong with his middle. Wet and hot and fundamentally broken. He'd tried to stand, managed to get to his knees before the second wave of pain hit. Someone grabbed his arm. His corporal, Heinrich, a baker's son from Munich, who'd been telling stories about his girlfriend just that morning. Heinrich dragged him maybe 20 meters before another explosion sent them both sprawling. When Weber opened his eyes again, Heinrich was gone. Everyone was gone. The sounds of battle had moved west, toward Bastogne proper. He was alone, in the snow, bleeding, with the winter afternoon fading into evening. That's when his hand twitched, and that's when 2 American medics saw him. They appeared like ghosts through the smoke. 2 men in olive drab uniforms, with red crosses on their helmets and armbands, moving in a crouch across the open ground where Weber lay. He could see them clearly now, though his vision was starting to narrow at the edges. They were arguing about something, pointing in different directions. Then one of them pointed directly at Weber. Klaus understood enough English to catch fragments. Over there, and still moving, and something about covering fire. The psychological conditioning kicked in immediately. They're going to execute me. That's what you did with enemy wounded, who couldn't be evacuated. That's what he'd been taught. That's what made sense in the brutal mathematics of war. He tried to make himself small, tried to play dead properly this time, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His hand kept moving. That damned involuntary twitch. The medics moved toward him at a run. Weber closed his eyes and waited for the bullet. Instead, he felt hands on his shoulders, on his chest. Someone was shouting in English, not at him, but past him, toward the American lines. The words were too fast, too urgent for Weber to translate, but the tone was unmistakable. Covering fire. We need covering fire. Rifles cracked. Machine guns chattered, but the sound wasn't coming closer. It was suppressing fire, keeping German positions from targeting the open ground. Weber felt himself being lifted, felt his body protest in ways that made him scream, felt strong hands grip him under his arms and knees. They were carrying him. The Americans were carrying him toward their lines. This made no sense. This violated everything he'd been taught about American soldiers, about American character, about the fundamental nature of war itself. They should have left him. They should have killed him. Instead, they were running. 600 meters of open ground, according to the after-action report Weber would read years later. Running with 160 pounds of enemy soldier while German rifles tried to kill them all. One of the medics, the shorter one with a Brooklyn accent Weber would later learn to recognize, kept talking the entire time. A stream of words that might have been encouragement or prayer or just nervous energy. Stay with us, buddy. Don't you quit. Don't you dare quit on us. Buddy. He'd called him Buddy. Weber's consciousness was fragmenting, sliding in and out like a radio losing signal. He caught images. the American trench line getting closer, faces staring as they stumbled over the edge, someone cutting his uniform away. The bizarre sensation of being carried down wooden steps into earth and darkness. The last thing he saw before passing out was a sign painted in English on a wooden board. Field Aid Station, 326th Medical Company. The last thing he thought was, this is wrong. This is all wrong. He woke to lamplight and morphine haze and the impossible sight of an American surgeon bent over his abdomen, working with the focused intensity of a watchmaker. The operating room was the basement of what had once been a bakery. Weber could smell it, the ghost of bread baked months ago, now mixed with the sharper scents of disinfectant and blood. The walls were stone, medieval thick, which was probably why the building still stood while everything around it had been reduced to rubble. Captain Jack Pryor of the United States Army Medical Corps didn't look up from his work. His hands moved with precise confidence, though Weber could see the strain around his eyes, the fatigue that came from performing surgery for hours in a basement with inadequate light and dwindling supplies. "You're awake," Pryor said, in accented but clear German. "That's good. Means you're a fighter." Weber tried to speak. His mouth was too dry. "Don't talk yet." Pryor's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. "You had about 8 pounds of shrapnel in your intestines. I've removed most of it. Some of it's too close to major vessels to extract safely, so it stays. You're going to have interesting stories for metal detectors for the rest of your life, assuming you don't do something stupid like die on me in the next 12 hours. The casualness of it shocked Weber almost as much as the fact of the surgery itself. This was an enemy officer. Weber was a prisoner. There should have been a queue. Americans first, then German wounded, if there was time, and supplies to spare. That's how it worked. That's how it had to work when resources were finite and men were dying. But there was no queue. He'd been brought straight to surgery. A nurse appeared at the edge of Weber's vision. A woman, startlingly, in this basement, in this battle. She handed Pryor an instrument, without being asked. The choreography of their movements suggested they'd done this 1,000 times. "Why?" Weber managed to croak. Pryor glanced at him just for a second, then returned to his sutures. "Why what?" "Why save me?" The surgeon was quiet for a moment, concentrating on his work. Then, "Because I'm a doctor, Lieutenant Weber. That's what doctors do. We save people." He paused, tied off something Weber couldn't see, continued, "Your uniform doesn't change the Hippocratic Oath. Neither does mine." It was such a simple answer, such an inadequate answer for something that was reshaping Weber's entire understanding of reality. "But your men..." Weber struggled with the English words. "They need supplies. Medicine." "We're short on everything," Pryor agreed. "Morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, whole blood. We're doing surgery by lamplight in a basement and sterilizing instruments in water we have to boil over a wood fire." He finally looked up, met Weber's eyes directly. "But that doesn't change what's right. You understand? Doesn't matter if you're German or American or Martian. You were dying. Now, you're not. End of discussion." The nurse said something in English. Pryor nodded, turned back to his work. Weber lay there, watching the lamplight flicker across the stone ceiling, trying to reconcile what was happening with everything he'd been taught. The propaganda had never mentioned this possibility. It had no category for enemy soldiers who carried you 600 meters under fire, no framework for surgeons who operated on you immediately, without hesitation, while their own wounded waited. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, more painful than the surgery itself. which the morphine had reduced to a distant pressure and heat. Somewhere above them, artillery hammered the frozen ground. The basement ceiling trembled. Dust sifted down. Pryor didn't even flinch. He just kept working, kept saving the life of a man who, 3 hours earlier, had been trying to kill men exactly like him. "Sleep now," Pryor said eventually, his voice shifting to something gentler. "You're going to be all right. I promise you that." And despite everything, despite being a prisoner, despite being defeated, despite the ruins of his belief system crumbling around him, Klaus Weber believed him. The recovery was its own education. They kept him in the basement for 3 days, until the immediate risk of infection had passed and the front lines had shifted enough to evacuate casualties. During those 3 days, Weber existed in a strange liminal space, no longer a combatant, not yet exactly a prisoner, just a wounded man among other wounded men. He watched. That's all he could do, really. Watch and listen and try to process the evidence accumulating around him. The American medics treated German wounded with the same urgency as their own. He saw it repeatedly. No hesitation, no hierarchy of care. When supplies ran low, they were rationed equally. When morphine had to be conserved, German and American soldiers both went without. The cruelty was in the shortage itself, not in its distribution. One morning, a German private was brought in with a sucking chest wound. The medics worked on him for 40 minutes, 2 of them trading off compressions while Pryor tried to stop the bleeding. The private died anyway. Weber watched Pryor sit back on his heels afterward, exhausted, and heard him say, in German, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," to a dead enemy soldier. The small kindnesses accumulated like evidence at a trial. The nurse who learned enough German to ask if he needed water. The corporal who shared cigarettes with German prisoners, talking about baseball in patient, simple English, while the Germans talked about football in broken phrases. The chaplain who offered to write letters home for wounded on both sides, making no distinction between Wehrmacht addresses and American ones. On the 4th day, they evacuated him. A truck convoy heading west, away from Bastogne, away from the collapsing German offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. Weber was loaded onto a canvas-topped transport with a dozen other wounded, 6 Americans, 6 Germans, all of them swaying together over rutted roads while a medic checked vitals and adjusted bandages without regard for nationality. He couldn't stop staring at the supplies. Even in retreat, even after weeks of intense combat, the Americans had supplies. Real bandages, not newspaper. Morphine, not just aspirin and prayer. The trucks themselves were new, mass-produced, identical. Evidence of an industrial capacity that made German manufacturing look like a craftsman's workshop. One of the American wounded, a kid from Oklahoma with his leg in a splint, caught Weber staring. "First time seeing American logistics?" The kid grinned, despite obvious pain. "Wait till you see the camps. 3 meals a day, hot showers. It's better than boot camp, honest to God." Weber didn't believe him, couldn't let himself believe him. But the doubt had taken root. The POW camp in Virginia demolished what remained of his certainties. They arrived in January of 1945, after weeks in a transit facility and an Atlantic crossing on a Liberty ship. Weber had spent the voyage expecting the worst. Prison hulks, starvation rations, the kind of treatment he'd been told Americans reserved for enemies. The propaganda had been clear about this too. Captured German soldiers were worked to death in mines, beaten by guards who took pleasure in cruelty, subjected to conditions that violated every convention of war. The reality was different. The camp sat on 200 acres of Virginia farmland, surrounded by wire fences and guard towers, but otherwise resembling a small, temporary town. Rows of barracks, freshly painted, a mess hall that served 3 meals daily, a recreation yard with volleyball nets, an infirmary staffed by American doctors who treated German ailments with the same professional detachment Captain Pryor had shown. The food was obscene, not in quality, it was military food, institutional and bland, but in quantity. Breakfast meant eggs and bread and coffee. Lunch meant meat and vegetables. Dinner meant more than Weber had eaten in a single day during the final months of the war in Europe. The first week, he couldn't finish his portions. His stomach had shrunk from privation. Other prisoners had the same problem. "They're fattening us up," one of the older prisoners muttered darkly, "making us strong so they can work us harder." But the work never came. Or rather, it came in the form of voluntary labor programs. Germans who wanted to work on nearby farms could earn small wages and spend time outside the wire. Those who preferred to stay in camp could take classes in English, attend religious services, play sports, or simply exist in a kind of suspended animation until the war ended. Weber took the English classes, partly for something to do, partly because he was beginning to understand that the war was lost, truly lost, not just tactically, but philosophically, and whatever came after would require different languages. The teacher was an older American woman, a volunteer from the local town who treated her students with the patient formality of someone teaching immigrants rather than enemies. She corrected their grammar without condescension, answered their questions about American culture without propaganda, admitted freely when she didn't know something. "Why are you kind to us?" Weber asked her once, in halting English. She'd looked at him for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Because the war won't last forever," she said finally. "And when it ends, you'll go home and be someone's neighbor, someone's co-worker, someone's father. The person you become matters. The way we treat you matters." It was such a profoundly different worldview that Weber had to sit with it for days before he could even begin to process it. The propaganda's lies revealed themselves in layers, each one more fundamental than the last. The mongrel nation of weak individualists. He watched American soldiers from every conceivable background coordinate with the smooth efficiency of a machine. Irish and Italian and Polish names. Black soldiers and white soldiers working side by side, despite the segregation Weber could see but didn't fully understand. Jewish doctors treating German prisoners without the revenge that would have been justified. The diversity wasn't weakness, it was a kind of strength the propaganda had never accounted for. The soft people without stomach for sacrifice. Every American guard he met had volunteered for service. The country could have stayed isolated, protected by its oceans. It had chosen to cross them instead, to fight in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, to commit resources on a scale that made Germany's total war economy look anemic. The inability to sustain long campaigns. By the spring of 1945, it was clear that American industrial capacity was essentially infinite. Tanks, planes, ships, supplies, they appeared in quantities that seemed physically impossible. A German panzer division considered itself lucky to field 50 operational tanks. American armored divisions had hundreds with spare parts and replacements in reserve. But the most devastating revelation wasn't about American strength. It was about German weakness. The rules of war that Weber had assumed were universal. The Geneva Conventions, the treatment of prisoners, the basic humanitarian standards. Germany had violated them systematically. not by accident, not as individual war crimes, but as policy. As Weber talked to other prisoners, as he pieced together information from carefully worded questions and unguarded moments, a picture emerged of atrocities so vast they beggared comprehension. Concentration camps, mass executions, systematic genocide. He didn't believe it at first, couldn't believe it. These were enemy allegations, propaganda designed to demoralize, but the evidence kept accumulating. American newspapers reached the camp. Censored, yes, but showing photographs from liberated camps that made Weber physically ill. German officers who'd been captured in the East spoke in whispers about things they'd seen, things they'd been ordered to do or ignore. The Red Cross confirmed it. His own memories confirmed it. Small details he'd dismissed or rationalized suddenly taking on horrifying new meaning. The trains he'd seen heading east, with civilian passengers who never seemed to return. The standing orders to treat partisan resistance with collective punishment. The casual dehumanization in official communications. Weber had known Germany was losing the war. He'd known it since Bastogne, probably earlier. But this was different. This was understanding that Germany deserved to lose the war. That the cause he'd fought for wasn't merely defeated, but morally bankrupt. The shame was crushing. When the war ended in May of 1945, Weber felt nothing. No relief, no grief, just a kind of numbness that he'd later recognize as the early stages of identity reconstruction. They kept him in the POW camp through the summer. The voluntary work programs expanded. Some prisoners chose to stay in America, having fallen in love with the country or seen nothing left for them in Europe's ruins. Weber wanted to go home, not out of patriotism, which had died somewhere in a Belgian forest, but out of responsibility. There would be work to do, amends to make, if amends were even possible. Before he left, something extraordinary happened. An American officer visited the camp, collecting testimony for the war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg. He interviewed dozens of German prisoners about their treatment in American custody, building a record of adherence to international law that could be presented as evidence of American moral authority. Weber volunteered to testify. He told them everything. The medics under fire, Captain Pryor's surgery in the basement, the equitable treatment at the field hospital, the abundance of the POW camps. He spoke carefully, factually, without exaggeration. The truth was dramatic enough. "Why are you doing this?" the interviewer asked. Weber chose his words carefully. "Because it's true," he said, "and because if we don't tell the truth about what happened, all of what happened, we learn nothing. We're condemned to repeat it." The interviewer nodded, made notes, moved on to procedural questions about dates and locations. But Weber felt something shift inside him. For the first time since the snow outside Bastogne, he felt like he had a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He returned to Germany in the autumn of 1946. The country was unrecognizable. Not just physically, though the ruins were shocking enough, but spiritually. The collective reckoning with Nazi crimes was paralyzing. Some Germans denied everything, retreated into conspiracy theories and bitter resentment. Others collapsed under the weight of guilt, unable to reconcile their personal decency with their national complicity. Weber tried to find a middle path. He got work as a translator, first with the occupation authorities, then with German reconstruction organizations. He married, had children, built a quiet life in the new Federal Republic. But he never forgot. He talked about his experience with anyone who would listen. Not to absolve himself. He'd been a soldier in an evil cause, and that fact couldn't be erased. But to testify to the possibility of humanity even in humanity's worst moments, to the American medics who'd risked their lives for an enemy, to Captain Pryor, who'd honored his oath regardless of the uniform his patient wore. He wrote letters to the US Army, trying to track down the men who'd saved him. Most went unanswered. The war had scattered them across the country, back to farms and factories and families. But in 1972, he finally received a response. Captain Jack Pryor had died the previous year and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Weber saved for a year, arranged the necessary visas. In June of 1973, at the age of 52, he flew to Washington, D.C. Arlington was vast, ordered rows of white markers extending across hills like a geometric forest. It took him 2 hours to find Pryor's grave. When he did, he stood there for a long time, unsure what to say or do. Finally, he knelt in the grass, placed his hand on the marble headstone. "Thank you," he said in English, the language he'd learned in a POW camp from a volunteer teacher. "Thank you for my life, for my children's lives, for teaching me that the enemy's humanity doesn't disappear just because we call them enemy." He stayed until the shadows lengthened, until a groundskeeper politely informed him the cemetery would be closing soon. Klaus Weber died in 1992, at home in Stuttgart, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He was 71 years old, 48 years older than he'd been on that December afternoon when his hand twitched in the snow. His family buried him with a photograph from Virginia, 1945. It showed a group of German prisoners smiling awkwardly for an American camera, healthy and fed and alive despite having every reason to expect otherwise. One of his granddaughters asked about the photograph. "Opa, why do you keep this? You're smiling in a prison camp." Weber had touched the frame gently. "Because it taught me the most important lesson of my life," he said. "That propaganda dies when it meets human beings. That the enemy is only the enemy until someone decides to see a person instead." He'd paused, choosing his next words carefully. "And because your great-grandmother would never have met me, and your mother would never have been born, and you would never have asked me this question if 2 American soldiers hadn't decided that a human life, even an enemy life, was worth saving." The story might have ended there, with Weber's death and burial, a single transformed life among millions. But stories like this don't really end. They replicate, they spread. Weber's children told his story to their children. His testimony at Nuremberg remained in the archives. The records of the 326th Medical Company documented dozens of similar cases. Enemy wounded, treated with the same urgency as American casualties, humanity preserved in the midst of mechanized slaughter. In 2004, Weber's grandson visited Bastogne for the 60th anniversary of the battle. He walked the ground where his grandfather had lain, bleeding in the snow. The forest had grown back. The shell craters had softened. The town had been rebuilt. But in the museum, he found documentation of American medical units that had treated over 3,000 German wounded during the battle. 3,000 enemy soldiers who should have died, but didn't. 3,000 men who went home to families, jobs, ordinary lives made possible by medics and surgeons who honored their oaths regardless of flags. How many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren existed because of those decisions? How many would never exist if those medics had simply walked past? The math was impossible. The impact, incalculable. December 22nd, 2024. 80 years, exactly. A group of military historians stand in the snow outside Bastogne recording an oral history project about the Battle of the Bulge. They interview veterans, fewer each year, the surviving soldiers now in their late 90s or older. They interview descendants. They interview local residents who still remember the winter the war came to their town. One of the historians mentions Klaus Weber's story. She shows the others the documentation. After-action reports from the 326th Medical Company, Weber's testimony at Nuremberg, his letters to the army kept in archives, the photograph of his visit to Arlington. It's remarkable, she says, how one decision in the snow reverberates forward. Those medics had no idea they were changing history. They were just doing their jobs. Her colleague nods. That's the thing about moral courage. It rarely feels heroic in the moment. It just feels like the only choice you can live with. They pack up their equipment as afternoon fades to evening. The snow begins to fall, softer now than it did 80 years ago. Or perhaps it only seems that way with the benefit of distance and peace. Somewhere in the archives, Weber's testimony waits. Somewhere in Stuttgart, his grandchildren carry photographs. Somewhere in the administrative records of 1,000 hospitals and POW camps, the evidence accumulates. Humans treating humans with decency, even when ideology demanded otherwise. The propaganda promised that the enemy was different, subhuman, irredeemable. But in the basement of a ruined bakery, under lamplight and falling bombs, a surgeon saved a life, because that's what surgeons do. And in that moment, in the 600 meters of desperate running, in the decision to operate without hesitation, in the simple refusal to let a human being die in the snow, the propaganda lost. Not permanently, not completely. Hatred and dehumanization would return in different forms, different wars, different propaganda. But for Klaus Weber, for the 3,000 German wounded treated by American medics, for the millions who came after, and the children who would never have been born, the propaganda lost. And humanity, improbable and fragile and persistent, survived. That's the story. Not of victory or defeat, not of good versus evil in simple terms, but of the quiet moral decisions that persist after the artillery falls silent, of hands that lift instead of kill, of oaths honored regardless of uniform, of the stubborn human insistence that even in war's worst moments, decency is possible. Klaus Weber's hand twitched in the snow. Someone saw it and decided that mattered. Everything else followed from that single choice. The rest is history, the kind written not in strategy and statistics, but in the accumulation of small mercies, the compounding interest of compassion, the long-term arithmetic of treating enemies as human beings who might someday become something other than enemies. It's the kind of history that doesn't make headlines, but changes the world anyway, one saved life at a time.